The Holocaust's darkest truth, silence at a meeting, revealed a system built solely to erase lives.
You've seen photos like this. Maybe you paused, maybe you looked away. But behind every face here, every bone, every bruise, there was a name, a voice, a life that never got to finish its sentence.
The camp's name is Stutthof, and one of its most infamous guards will become Jenny van der Bergman.
These weren't just victims, they were people waiting to be remembered. When the camps were opened, the world called it liberation. But for the ones who walked out, freedom was a word with no shape. What followed wasn't peace, it was confusion, sickness, silence.
Franz Stengel was in charge of a massive killing machine.
This isn't just about the Holocaust, it's about what happened after and the battle to be seen again. Bureaucracy before barbed wire. It didn't begin with gas chambers, it began with paper. In 19F, inside quiet government offices across Germany, typewriters clicked, pens scratched across parchment, and laws were passed with signatures instead of screams. The Nuremberg laws, they called them. Stripped of citizenship, Jews were no longer Germans in the eyes of the state. They were removed from classrooms, parks, courtrooms, and professions, not by violence, but by decree. Their names vanished from registers. Their homes were marked, and slowly, silently, they became invisible. It was clinical, calculated, dispossession disguised as policy. Then came Kristallnacht. One night in November 1938, the glass of synagogues and Jewish stores shattered across German streets, reflecting the firelight from torched Torah scrolls. Nearly 100 Jews were killed. Thousands more were arrested. Some were taken to places like Dachau and Buchenwald, names the world would learn far too late. It was presented as retaliation. But it wasn't anger, it was a signal. Violence had now stepped out from behind the desk. But what followed wasn't an explosion. It was a tightening noose. More laws, more fines, more families were forced to surrender homes, businesses, and identity cards.
When we look back, the Allied liberation of the Nazi camps in 1944-45 had a huge impact on our collective memory.
Even the names of their children were regulated. Sarah for girls, Israel for boys. The Nazis weren't in a rush. They wanted the Jewish people to disappear in slow motion, one document at a time. By 1939, escape routes were closing. Borders shut tight. Foreign visas denied. The world watched, debated, sympathized, and did nothing. And so with no place left to go, Europe's Jews waited for someone to intervene, waited for the worst. Most didn't know they were already on a list, already scheduled to vanish. Not because of who they were, but because of what they were not allowed to be anymore. Death by design, the camps. When the war began, the illusion ended. What was once oppression on paper became murder by architecture. Barbed wire spread like veins across the continent. Ghettos formed, surrounded by walls and silence. In places like Warsaw, Łódź, and Vilna, entire neighborhoods became holding cells. Jewish families crammed into cold apartments. Food was rationed. The disease moved faster than hoped. But these ghettos weren't the destination. They were the waiting rooms. Beyond them, hidden behind forests and fences, were the camps, more than 40,000 of them, men. Some were for labor, some for punishment. Some, like Treblinka, were made only for death. Efficiency ruled everything. At Chomno, trucks became mobile gas chambers. At Majdanek, prisoners built the very ovens they would later burn in. At Janowska, guards laughed as prisoners were forced to dance before being shot. The forest echoed with music, and then with nothing. In Sobibor and Belzec, the process was timed to the minute. In Auschwitz, it was industrialized. Zyklon B was dropped through holes in the ceiling. Screams lasted for 15 minutes, then silence again. No bullets wasted, no emotion shown. Even the bodies were categorized. Gold teeth extracted, hair shaved, bones crushed for fertilizer. It was more than murder.
Nazi Germany stripped women of identity. Some endured horrific abuse, marked only by numbers and silence.
It was a system built to erase. The most chilling moment didn't come from a scream, it came from a meeting. In January 1942, 15 men gathered beside a frozen lake in a quiet Berlin villa. Over cognac and cigars, they discussed how to exterminate 11 million people. It took less than 90 minutes. They called it the final solution. Outside, the snow kept falling, and across Europe, the machinery turned faster. Deportation lists grew, Trains moved at night, names became numbers, and the world's silence stretched even longer. Liberation in the new silence. They called it liberation. British soldiers walked into Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, expecting a prison. What they found was something else. The ground was soft with decay. Bodies lay in piles, thousands of them, unburied, unnamed. A woman sat beside her daughter's corpse, still combing her hair. A child clutched a crust of bread, too weak to chew. The survivors stared with hollow eyes, blinking at the sun like they'd forgotten it existed. But freedom for them had no shape. It had no bed, no voice, and no food they could swallow. It was a word people kept saying, but it didn't match the world around them. Diseases spread quickly: typhus, dysentery, the kind of sickness that feeds on hunger. British doctors tried, but many survivors died after the liberation, too damaged, too far gone. Others survived physically but were lost in other ways. They didn't remember how to smile. They didn't speak much. They flinched at footsteps. And then came the next wound: paperwork. Without documents, they became ghosts. The Nazis, retreating from the camps, had burned files, erased lists, destroyed birth records and identification cards. What remained were numbers tattooed on arms and fragments of memory. And those weren't enough. Where do you go when no country claims you? When your home was burned, your family gone, your name buried in ashes? Displaced persons camps filled up with tens of thousands: Jews, Roma, and political prisoners. Some stayed for years, in the same kind of wooden barracks, under the same cold roofs. Only now the guards were different, and the gates stayed open. The world had moved on to rebuilding, celebrating victory, drawing new maps. But for the survivors, the war hadn't ended. It had just changed form, from brutality to neglect, from screams to silence. They were alive, but not yet seen. Trials and shadows, Nuremberg and beyond. Justice, when it finally came, wore robes and sat behind microphones. In Nuremberg from 1945 to 1946, 24 senior Nazi officials stood in the dock, men who had ordered death with signatures, who had calculated extermination by the hour. The courtroom was filled with translation headsets, black and white flash bulbs, and the heavy silence of those trying to understand how the unthinkable had happened. The trials were unprecedented: crimes against humanity, war crimes, aggression. A new language was born to name what had been done. But even as the world watched, something was missing. For every high-ranking Nazi on trial, there were thousands more who never saw a judge. Guards, doctors, bureaucrats, camp administrators who had chosen who would live and who would die with a glance or a gesture. They were not in the dock. They were in villages, in hospitals, in homes. Many were already using false names. Some were even being quietly recruited by governments that now saw the Soviets, not the Nazis, as the greater enemy. In the British zone, some former SS were hired as informants. In the US, Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists into American labs. Justice became blurred by politics. Still, smaller trials did take place. In Poland, in Germany, in the Soviet Union. Camp commandants like Arthur Liebehenschel were tried and hanged. Guards like Irma Gracie, the hyena of Auschwitz, faced justice too. But these were only fragments. There was no master list of criminals, no uniform process, and no international agreement to pursue everyone. Survivors watched as the machinery that had destroyed their families was only partly dismantled. Sometimes they had to testify, stand in court, and relive what they had spent years trying to forget. For others, justice came in whispers. A neighbor is disappearing. A name finally recognized in a news clipping. The trials proved something crucial. The world had not completely forgotten, but they also exposed a cruel truth. Justice, like survival, was uneven, and for many, it would remain unfinished. Amon Guth and the local reckonings. Some names became symbols. Amon Guth was one of them. He wasn't a bureaucrat. He didn't hide behind a desk. He stood on balconies with a rifle, looked down at prisoners, and fired when they didn't move fast enough. At the Plaszow camp near Krakow, Guth ruled with his version of law, one made of terror, teeth, and silence. His villa overlooked the camp. From its windows, he watched people like ants, disposable and small. He beat prisoners publicly, ordered attacks with dogs, shot without reason. And when the Krakow ghetto was liquidated, he oversaw it personally. Over 2,000 Jews were rounded up, and many were killed on the streets. Children were ripped from hiding places. Families were shattered in seconds. Witnesses remembered his laugh. After the war, Goethe was captured by Allied forces. In 1946, he was tried in Poland. Survivors came forward, thin, trembling, staring at the man who had haunted their nights.
The number of eyewitnesses who were actually victims of the Nazi regime were somewhat limited at Nuremberg.
One by one, they told their stories. The beatings, the shootings, the Hunger Games played with human lives. Some had been forced to dig their graves. The court sentenced him to death. But even in the end, fate didn't offer peace. The noose failed the first time. He choked, gasping. It took a second attempt. His last words? Heil Hitler. Justice in that moment was both delivered and delayed. Others followed. Jenny Wanda Barkman, a female guard from Stutthof known for injecting prisoners with phenol.
The camp's name is Stutthof, and one of its most infamous guards will become Jenny Wanda Barkman.
Was executed in 1946. So was Gerda Steinhoff. These were not generals or ministers. They were nurses, secretaries, and guards.
Steinhoff became not just a regular guard, but a block leader. This would have seen Steinhoff in command of a barrack full of up to 300 prisoners, overseeing the prisoners' daily life in the camp.
People who had choices and still chose cruelty. Yet for every trial like Goethe's, dozens never happened. Courts struggled to keep up. Records were lost, names changed, and as time passed, even memory began to fade. But the survivors remembered, always, because they didn't just lose families or homes, they lost the sound of laughter, the idea of safety, the belief that justice would come. Goethe's trial was not just about one man. It was a reminder that evil had a face, and that sometimes that face looked calm, even kind, until it pulled the trigger.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
The Nazi hunters and the ghosts. The war had ended, but for many survivors, the real hunt had just begun. In 1947, inside a small, unremarkable office in Linz, Austria, a man named Simon Wiesenthal sat at a desk stacked with yellowed papers, photographs, and names that refused to die. He wasn't a judge. He wasn't a soldier. He was a survivor. And he had decided that memory alone wasn't enough. There had to be records, evidence, justice. Using nothing but handwritten lists, scraps of testimony, and grainy snapshots, Wiesenthal started chasing ghosts, guards who had vanished, doctors who'd changed their names. Camp officials are now living as farmers, tailors, or factory workers. For every trace he followed, another seemed to disappear. But he wasn't alone. Across Europe, others joined, the Jewish Search Committee, local volunteers. Even a few soldiers are still stationed on broken soil. They hunted in silence across train stations and town halls into countries that preferred not to look back. West Germany created the Zentralstelle Ludwigsburg in 1958, an official body tasked with investigating Nazi crimes. It launched over 7,000 inquiries, but only 136 ended in convictions. Justice was slow. Sometimes it wasn't justice at all. Statutes of limitations meant that by the 1960s, many crimes were no longer legally punishable. Governments wanted to move forward. Cold War politics shifted attention elsewhere, and yet a few cases broke through. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, was found in Brazil and brought to trial in Germany.
Franz Stangl was in charge of a massive killing machine.
Hermine Braunsteiner, a brutal camp guard, was tracked down in New York and extradited. Each name unburied was a small victory against forgetting. But most of the executioners vanished into ordinary lives. Some wore suits, others sat in church. A few even entered politics, their pasts erased by time or buried by those who didn't want to remember. Wiesenthal never stopped. Survival, he once said, is a form of resistance. And so was remembering, because behind every name on his wall was a scream that had once echoed in a forest. A mother's cry, a brother's silence, a child's unfinished question. The hunters couldn't undo what had been done, but they could make sure the world never looked away again. Exodus 1947. The ship that screamed. It wasn't a warship. It wasn't even seaworthy by most standards, but it carried something heavier than weapons. Memory. The Exodus 1947 left the port of Sète in southern France carrying over 4,500 Jewish refugees, many of them Holocaust survivors. They had no homes left in Europe, no graves to visit, no families to find. What they had was a destination, Palestine, and a hope fragile and burning. They had survived the camps, now they had to survive the sea. The British still controlled Palestine, and with it, strict immigration quotas. Just 1,500 Jews per month were allowed in. The exodus didn't ask permission. It sailed anyway, coordinated by the Aliyah Bet, the underground network smuggling Jewish survivors to the land they now called a promise. On July 18, 1947, the British Navy intercepted the ship near Haifa. The refugees resisted, not with weapons, but with locked doors and shouted prayers. The soldiers came anyway, clubbed them, dragged them, took them from the decks in front of the cameras. Photographs made headlines. Tattooed arms reaching skyward, faces bruised, not from war, but from the refusal to stay hidden any longer. The British transferred the passengers to 3 old cargo ships turned into floating prisons. Heat blistered the decks. Food and water were scarce. Still they endured. When Britain tried to return them to France, the refugees refused to disembark. They had already been thrown out of one continent. They wouldn't let it happen again. France stalled. And so in September, the ships were rerouted to Germany. Yes, Germany. The same soil that had tried to erase them now received them again. This time in internment camps surrounded by barbed wire. The irony was unbearable. But the photographs did what speeches hadn't. They forced the world to listen. These weren't anonymous survivors anymore. These were witnesses, returned from hell, still without a home. And the exodus, barely afloat, became a cry the world could no longer ignore. Latin America, exile or escape? Not all journeys ended in Israel. Some ended where the stars felt unfamiliar, and the languages spoke neither comfort nor memory. Latin America opened its doors cautiously. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Mexico received Jewish refugees after the war. But those doors were not always welcoming. Behind them were more borders, more suspicions, more unspoken walls. In Argentina, under Juan Perón, nearly 30,000 Jewish immigrants found a fragile refuge. Some rebuilt lives, opened businesses, formed schools and synagogues, but they did so under shadows.
But he knew their butchers were also walking on this very ground.
Because in the same country, former Nazis walked free. The same ships that carried survivors also carried war criminals, hidden in forged documents in Catholic silence. In Brazil, integration came with a price. Baptism certificates were sometimes required for jobs. Many hid their identity, reshaping their names, tucking memories beneath new clothes. Some adapted. They changed their names. They hid their identities. They hid themselves behind a new mask. Others, silently, never did. In Uruguay, nationalism grew louder during the post-war years. Jewish immigrants faced prejudice that felt all too familiar. Children heard slurs in schoolyards. Families were told to leave behind the past. What did that even mean? The past wasn't a coat you could shrug off. It was in their accents. On the way, they flinched at loud noises. In the photographs, they didn't hang. In the silence between sentences, they built communities anyway. Lit candles, celebrated births, buried their dead. But even surrounded by warmth, there remained a kind of exile. Not from a country, but from a time before the camps, when the word home didn't need an asterisk. The contradiction was sharp. In towns where they taught Hebrew to children, some former SS officers lived under new names, sometimes only blocks away. Latin America offered survival, but not always peace, and not always justice. Other shadows, gypsies, communists, witnesses, and the forgotten. The Holocaust silence didn't just swallow Jewish voices. Others vanished in its echo. The Romani, called gypsies in official Nazi documents, were hunted under something called the Decree for the Fight Against the Gypsy Plague. Entire families were rounded up, sterilized, and sent to camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, where their section bore a Z for Zigeuner. There they died of starvation, disease, and gassing. Between 220,000 and 500,000 were murdered. After the war, the world barely noticed. In West Germany, the 1953 laws refused to recognize their persecution as racial. They were called criminals, not victims. Compensation was denied. For decades, they were told, your suffering didn't count. It wasn't until 1979 that the Romani genocide, Parajmos, was officially acknowledged. Others faded too. Communists who survived camps like Buchenwald were treated differently depending on where they emerged. In East Germany, some became leaders. In the Soviet bloc, others were accused of deviationism, a crime invented by paranoia. They were sent to new prisons, this time under red flags. Jehovah's Witnesses, persecuted for refusing to swear allegiance to Hitler or serve in the army, were left to rebuild their broken congregations in silence. Over 1,500 of them had died in the camps, but they asked for no revenge, just the right to stand without fear. And the pink triangle? That was for gay men. Marked, beaten, experimented on. Released only to find that outside the camps, their existence was still illegal. Paragraph 175, the Nazi-era anti-homosexuality law, remained in West German law until 1969. Survivors of the camps were sometimes rearrested. Their names remained on criminal registries. The war had ended, but the shame was never lifted. These lives, these forgotten survivors, carried wounds the world refused to see. They didn't write memoirs. They weren't invited to courtrooms. They weren't asked how they endured, but they did. And their silence isn't absent. It's a different kind of testimony. The rise of Israel, from ashes to nationhood. In the ruins of Europe, a different kind of map was forming, one drawn not with ink, but with footsteps. Holocaust survivors, many still wrapped in military blankets, began arriving in Palestine, some by foot, some by ship. Most carried nothing but names etched in memory and numbers on skin. What they sought was not revenge, but a beginning. And not just for themselves, for all who could no longer return. By 1947, over 600,000 Jews lived in Palestine, alongside 1.2 million Arabs. The British, caught between rising tensions and global pressure, prepared to leave. The United Nations stepped in. On November 29, 1947, Resolution 181 was passed, and Palestine would be divided into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. Celebrations broke out in some streets, rage in others. On May 14, 1948, in a modest building in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stood before a crowd and declared the State of Israel. Outside, children waved handmade flags. Inside, survivors listened. Some wept. They had wandered through ghettos and ashes in camps, and now a nation had said, "You belong," but it would not be peaceful. Arab nations rejected the plan. War broke out. The new state was immediately attacked from all sides. As Jewish immigrants arrived, many straight from displaced persons camps, they were handed rifles and sent to the front lines. They didn't yet know Hebrew. Some had never fired a gun, but they had survived Auschwitz. And survival, by then, was a language of its own. Between 1948 and 1951, more than 300,000 Holocaust survivors came to Israel. They lived in tents, in hastily built neighborhoods, in dusty border towns like Beersheba and Dimona. Many had been scholars or musicians. Now they built roads, laid bricks, dug wells. They didn't forget what they had lost, but they planted something new. Because for them, survival was no longer enough. They wanted continuity, a land that would not shut its gates, a future that would remember the past, not as tragedy, but as fuel. And so, out of smoke and silence, a state rose. Not perfect, not peaceful, but theirs. Mossad, memory turned into doctrine. A nation had been born, but memory still burned, and threats were never far. The survivors had seen what happened when no one was watching, when warnings were ignored, when evil wore a uniform and knocked at the door. That silence, that blindness, they vowed it would never happen again. In 1951, Israel formed its official intelligence agency, the Mossad. It didn't begin in glass towers or war rooms. It started in dusty offices, staffed by men and women who still carried trauma like a second skin. Many were veterans of the Jewish resistance. Others had buried entire families. They weren't spies because it was exciting. They were spies because it was necessary. Their mission wasn't just defense, it was a memory. One of their earliest operations, named after the biblical Ezra and Nehemiah, airlifted over 120,000 Iraqi Jews to safety. Another traced whispers across Vienna, Rome, and Buenos Aires, searching for the men who had vanished into the shadows after 1945. Doctors from Auschwitz, SS officers from Treblinka, bureaucrats who signed death orders and then disappeared behind new names. The Mossad learned fast how to forge passports, how to infiltrate governments, how to disappear and reappear. They weren't chasing power, they were chasing ghosts. and in 1960 they caught one. Adolf Eichmann, the engineer of the final solution, found in Argentina, living under the name Ricardo Clement. He was kidnapped, smuggled to Jerusalem, and placed behind bulletproof glass. His trial revealed the architecture of genocide to the world. His face, expressionless. His defense? I was just following orders. He was hanged in 1962, the only civil execution in Israel's history, but it wasn't vengeance. It was a line drawn in history. Mossad wasn't just a spy agency, it was a promise that Jews would never again beg foreign powers to act, that no grave would go unguarded, that no whisper would be lost to time. They couldn't bring back the dead, but they could make sure no one disappeared again, not without someone coming after them. They weren't just numbers on arms. They were names whispered in the dark, stories left unfinished. Not all found justice, not all found peace, but many found voices, etched into testimonies, carved into gravestones, hidden in photographs someone kept. The world tried to move on, rebuild, forget. But memory doesn't ask for permission. It lingers. In songs sung quietly, in eyes that won't close, in names read aloud each year. Survival was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of a second life, a quieter one, built from loss and lit by defiance. Not all were saved, but none are forgotten.